The northeastern United States is often imagined as a pulsating heart of American life, a region bursting with people, iconic cities, and relentless motion. Over 50 million people call this compact corner home, packed into urban sprawls like New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. The Northeast is the country's most densely populated region, but there's a curious twist hiding in plain sight. Venture a few hundred miles north, away from the congested highways and city skylines, and the image begins to unravel. Suddenly, the landscape stretches wide and quiet. The buzz of metropolitan life fades into whispering forests, jagged mountains, and towns so small they barely register on a map. This is America's empty Northeast, a vast and sparsely populated region encompassing northern New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and most of Maine. Despite its location inside the nation's busiest corridor, this frontier remains one of the most underpopulated areas east of the Mississippi. Why? Why does this region, nestled in one of the most crowded corners of the U.S., remain so empty? To understand this paradox, we need to look beyond population maps and zoom out to the land itself, because here, geography tells the whole story. When people think of the Northeast, they usually picture bustling cities and cozy towns with autumn leaves tumbling through the streets. But just north of those iconic scenes lies an entirely different world, one shaped not by people, but by ancient earth-shaking forces. Let's begin with the terrain. While the southern half of New England and New York is characterized by rolling hills and coastal plains, the northern half is mountainous, wild, and largely untamed. These aren't towering peaks like the Rockies, but don't let that fool you. The northern Appalachians are no joke. Start with the Adirondacks of upstate New York, a massive dome of rock and forest covering over 6 million acres. This range is one of the largest intact wilderness areas in the continental U.S. More than 2,000 miles of trails crisscross peaks and valleys, yet entire swaths remain undeveloped and inaccessible. The Adirondacks are rugged in a quiet, brooding way, beautiful but deeply isolating. East of the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains carve a dramatic spine through Vermont, extending north into Quebec. To the east of them again, the White Mountains rise in New Hampshire, home to Mount Washington, infamous for some of the worst weather in North America. Farther east still, the forests of Maine swallow up roads and rivers as the western Maine Mountains blend into Canada. These ranges are not just scenic features, they are real obstacles. They divided people, isolated towns, and shaped entire histories. But elevation alone doesn't explain the emptiness. Another ancient culprit played a major role: ice. During the last ice age, massive glaciers swept across the Northeast like cosmic bulldozers, scraping the land down to bedrock. When they retreated some 10,000 years ago, they left behind a battered, rocky, and irregular terrain. The scars remain. Thousands of glacial lakes dot the region, while jagged soils filled with rock and clay blanket much of the ground. This glaciated legacy is one of the region's defining features and one of its greatest limitations. The soil in much of the northern Northeast is poor for farming. It's thin, acidic, and hard to work. Compared to the rich farmlands of the Hudson Valley, the Connecticut River Valley, or the Midwest, this land is tough and offers little in return. There is an almost overwhelming abundance of water in the empty Northeast. Lake Champlain stretches along the New York-Vermont border, a freshwater inland sea. Dozens of smaller lakes fill the Adirondacks. The Androscoggin and Kennebec rivers slice through Maine. Countless brooks, ponds and wetlands give the landscape a damp, shimmering texture. It's a paradise for kayakers and canoeists, but a headache for would-be settlers. While water bodies can serve as highways for commerce and travel, they also fragment land, complicate infrastructure, and make large-scale farming difficult. Combined with the region's steep slopes and rocky earth, these water features added to the challenge of building cohesive, thriving communities in the deep north. Then one of the region's most visually striking and historically significant features is its forest. Northern New England and upstate New York remain some of the most heavily forested areas in the eastern U.S. From the pine-covered peaks of the Adirondacks to the dense spruce fir forests of Maine's North Woods, this region is a sea of green. These aren't just patches of trees. This is an almost unbroken canopy stretching for hundreds of miles. A mix of boreal and temperate forest that supports bears, moose, bobcats, and countless species of birds. These forests are ecologically vital and stunningly beautiful, but historically, they posed a serious barrier to development. Settlers hoping to establish farms or towns in the 1700s and 1800s faced backbreaking work. Clearing the land meant felling massive, old-growth trees by hand, hauling stumps from rocky ground, and battling harsh winters along the way. While the forests eventually gave rise to timber and paper industries, and still support logging to this day, they didn't offer the kind of economic magnetism that would draw large populations the way iron, coal, or gold did elsewhere. Instead, they functioned like nature's keep out sign, making expansion slow and sporadic. The final element of this physical puzzle is the climate. All of the Northeast experiences 4 seasons, but in the North, winter is something else entirely. Longer, colder, and snowier than its southern counterparts, the empty Northeast lives under a different sky. Snow blankets the ground for months. Ice storms cut power to remote homes. The growing season is short, and the heating bills are long. For much of U.S. history, when people were choosing where to build their lives, harsh winters were a strong deterrent. Why scrape out a living in frozen forest land when milder options existed just a few hundred miles away, or in the booming Midwest or warm South? This combination, mountains, glacial scars, rocky soil, dense forests, and fierce winters, forms a natural wall around the empty Northeast. It's not that people were never here. It's that the land itself demanded a steep price, and many simply chose not to pay it. Before this landscape was ever called empty, it was alive with the rhythm of indigenous life. The forests and rivers of northern New York and New England were home to a mosaic of Native American nations, each with deep cultural, spiritual, and ecological ties to the land. They didn't simply survive here, they thrived. The Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, Confederacy to the west and the Abenaki to the north and east built seasonal settlements, trade networks, and hunting routes throughout what we now call the empty Northeast. The Abenaki people, in particular, had deep roots in what's now Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, often moving between upland forests in the summer and lower valleys in the winter. Rather than trying to conquer the rugged terrain, Native people worked with it. They followed river routes in birch bark canoes and used seasonal patterns to their advantage. Trade flourished across this forested corridor from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Maine, long before a single European settler ever set foot here. But the arrival of European colonizers in the 17th and 18th centuries shattered this delicate balance. From the earliest days of European colonization, the Northeast's northern frontier became a zone of conflict. While the English took root along the southern coast of New England, the French moved into Canada and claimed vast swaths of what is now northern Maine and New York. The region between the empty Northeast became a buffer zone and eventually a battleground. For more than a century, France and England waged a series of wars over control of North America. In the forests of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, these weren't formal battles with clean lines. They were brutal skirmishes, raids, and ambushes, fought between colonial militias, indigenous allies, and European armies. The French built outposts and missions deep in the Northwoods. The British responded with forts and garrisons of their own. Towns were burned, alliances made and broken, and indigenous nations were caught in the crossfire. The American Revolution added another layer of violence and complexity. Then came the War of 1812, which again turned parts of northern New York and Maine into military staging grounds. Throughout this long and chaotic era, permanent settlement in the empty Northeast remained minimal. Why would any family build a homestead on contested ground, far from trade, and constantly under threat? By the time the U.S. had solidified control over the region in the early 1800s, the American frontier had already moved westward, and with it, the attention and ambitions of the young nation. After centuries of conflict, the empty Northeast was finally open for American settlement. But by then, much of the allure had faded. There was a brief flurry of town building in northern Vermont and upstate New York in the early 19th century. A few farming communities took root, and timber barons established logging towns in Maine and the Adirondacks. Still, most of the land remained wild. Many towns that sprang up in this period saw their populations plateau or even decline within decades. Why? The reasons are both practical and psychological. First, agriculture was extremely limited. Even with new technologies, farmers in the north faced short growing seasons, poor soil, and an unforgiving climate. Families could scratch out a living, but not much more. Second, transportation remained a nightmare. Roads were few and often impassable in winter. Rivers could be used for logs and canoes, but not for large-scale shipping. Without reliable access to markets, many towns withered on the vine. Third, the western frontier was calling. With the Erie Canal complete by the 1820s and railroads expanding westward, the rich farmland of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois became irresistible to Americans seeking opportunity. Compared to the deep snows and granite hills of New Hampshire, the open prairies of the Midwest seemed like paradise. The empty Northeast became a land of almost settled, almost successful, almost populous, but never quite. By the late 1800s, many communities in the empty Northeast were already shrinking. In Maine's Northwoods, mill towns that once buzzed with timber operations began to vanish as the trees were depleted. In Vermont and northern New Hampshire, hillside farms were abandoned. In the Adirondacks, the land was purchased by the state and gradually turned into protected wilderness. What remained were ghost towns, crumbling foundations in the woods, and cemeteries with no nearby living residents. Some towns dissolved entirely. Others were swallowed by reforested land. This retreat from the land is a rare reversal in American history, a moment when people left the frontier behind, not because they were forced to, but because they no longer believed in it. Oddly enough, it was this emptiness, this failure to develop, that gave birth to one of the region's modern identities: wilderness conservation. As the 20th century progressed, the wild beauty of the empty Northeast began to attract a new kind of American: the tourist, the hiker, the conservationist. The Adirondack Park was created in 1892, setting aside more than 6 million acres of forest preserve. The White Mountain National Forest was established in 1918, following years of devastating logging and fire. In Maine, massive swaths of northern forest were kept in private timber hands, but access was gradually opened to outdoor enthusiasts. Canoe trails, hiking paths, and hunting camps became common in areas that once hosted tiny villages or mills. Ironically, the lack of development made these regions attractive for exactly what they lacked: modernity. People from Boston, New York, and Montreal came to the empty Northeast not to live permanently, but to escape the very urban intensity they called home. By the mid-20th century, the fate of the empty Northeast seemed sealed. Unlike other rural areas in America that gradually industrialized or suburbanized, much of northern New England and upstate New York simply stopped changing. The cities to the south, Albany, Manchester, Portland, grew. Highways improved. But the deep interior of the region remained in a kind of suspended animation. The woods came back. Wildlife returned. Small towns shrank or stabilized at populations far below their 19th century peaks. It wasn't quite abandonment, but it was unmistakably stagnation. In many towns north of I-90 or above Route 2, life still feels a century behind. Main streets feature general stores and post offices, not Starbucks and shopping centers. Residents often heat with wood. Cell service can vanish for miles. Public transportation is nearly non-existent. Some communities, especially in Vermont and New Hampshire, survived on dairy farming or small-scale manufacturing. But global markets and automation steadily chipped away at those industries. Many paper mills in Maine and the North Country closed between the 1970s and 2000s, taking thousands of jobs with them. Today, the economy in many parts of the empty Northeast relies on just a handful of pillars: tourism, outdoor recreation, retirement migration, government services like public schools and post offices. Unemployment isn't always high, but wages are often low. Many young people leave, heading to Boston, New York, or beyond, with little intention of coming back. Paradoxically, as permanent population decline, the empty Northeast has become more attractive to outsiders, especially wealthy ones. Ski resorts like Stowe and Killington in Vermont, Sugarloaf in Maine, and Whiteface in New York now draw hundreds of thousands each winter. In summer, hikers flood the White Mountains and Adirondack high peaks. Kayakers, fly fishers, and photographers explore the Allagash Wilderness Waterway or the Saranac Lakes. Rustic cabins rent for thousands of dollars a week. Airbnb has brought urbanites into towns they'd never heard of 10 years ago. To many visitors, this region feels like a slice of heaven. Untouched forests, quaint villages, silence. But this influx of outsiders hasn't necessarily revived the region. Instead, it's created a two-tier reality. Locals, who struggle with housing shortages, stagnant wages, and lack of opportunity. Part-time residents and tourists, who often drive up property values while spending most of their time elsewhere. The result is an economic model not unlike parts of the American West. Rugged, beautiful, and increasingly owned or shaped by people who don't live there year-round. This demographic imbalance has big implications. Local tax bases in small towns remain thin. That means roads are potholed, schools consolidate or shut down, emergency services stretch thin. Broadband internet, a necessity in modern life, is still spotty or completely unavailable in vast areas. Want proof? Look at maps of cell coverage, high-speed internet access, or even basic road maintenance funding in northern Maine or the Adirondacks. The gaps are staggering, and because many towns have small, aging populations, there's often not enough political pressure to secure funding or change. The region falls between the cracks, too remote to attract big development, too thinly populated to matter in most elections. One of the most startling trends in the empty Northeast is its demographic tilt. In many counties, especially in northern Maine, Essex County, NY, and Coos County, NH, the median age is well above the national average. There's no youth boom, no new industries drawing in fresh workers. Public school enrollment is shrinking. Maternity wards have closed. In some towns, the local elementary school has fewer than 30 students total. This creates a reinforcing cycle. Fewer young families, fewer services. Fewer services, fewer people willing to move in, and so on. Despite all this, the people who remain often express fierce loyalty to the land and lifestyle. The pace is slower. The woods are always near. There's a pride in independence, in fixing what's broken, in knowing every neighbor, in surviving harsh winters with grit and tradition. So, is this region doomed to permanent stasis? Not necessarily. Two recent trends have reopened the conversation: remote work and climate migration. 1. Remote work's ripple effects. The COVID-19 pandemic proved that many jobs could be done from anywhere. And for a while, places like Vermont and rural New Hampshire saw an uptick in transplants. Young professionals, artists, and even tech workers moved from Boston or Brooklyn to places like Brattleboro or Montpelier, lured by cheaper homes and scenic surroundings. Some towns capitalized on this, offering relocation incentives or investing in broadband. A few even created co-working barns or digital community hubs. However, the growth has been uneven. While parts of southern Vermont and the western foothills have gained people, the deeper interior, especially in the north, has seen less impact. And as companies pull workers back to offices, it's unclear how permanent these changes are. 2. Climate migration and resilience. As the South and West face rising temperatures, water shortages, and stronger hurricanes, the cooler, wetter Northeast looks increasingly attractive. It's not immune to climate change, but it may be one of the more stable regions in the decades ahead. This idea has prompted a few long-range bets: investments in sustainable housing, ecological restoration, and energy self-sufficiency. Some demographers and planners believe places like the Upper Connecticut River Valley or inland Maine could see population rebounds as people flee unlivable zones elsewhere. But for that to happen, serious infrastructure work is needed, from internet access to healthcare to updated housing. Without that investment, the empty Northeast may simply remain empty. And there's an important irony here. The very traits that make this region seem left behind, its remoteness, its quiet, its underdevelopment, are also the reasons people fall in love with it. There's no sprawl, no traffic jams, no strip malls every few miles. Instead, there are towns where people still gather at general stores, where trails begin behind schoolhouses, where moose still outnumber humans in some counties. The challenge is preserving that character while also improving lives. Can you expand broadband without gentrifying a town beyond recognition? Can you build housing without destroying forest? Can you attract new people without pushing out the old? These are questions with no easy answers, but they're worth asking. The empty Northeast is not empty in the sense of being lifeless. It is empty of something else: density, urgency, fame. It is a place America has, over and over again, chosen to ignore. But perhaps that makes it more valuable than ever. In a century defined by noise, crowding, and disconnection, this old rugged frontier offers something increasingly rare: space, silence, and deep-rooted authenticity. Whether as a refuge, a home, or a lesson in balance, the empty Northeast is still here, waiting.